I'll introduce Lady Celeste Voss as the kingdom's future Luna." The words froze Rosalie Everhart where she stood. For one impossible heartbeat, she wondered if she had heard them wrong. She hadn't come looking for secrets. She wasn't following her husband. She certainly wasn't spying. She was carrying his lunch. Balanced carefully on a silver tray rested warm herb bread, roasted venison, and the honey tea Adrian always drank during long strategy meetings. For 6 years, she had brought him lunch whenever war or politics kept him locked inside the royal war chamber. It was a small tradition, one that reminded both of them they were husband and wife before they were king and queen. She smiled as she reached the chamber doors. Inside, voices drifted through the thick oak panels. The High Chancellor sounded uneasy. "The Northern Alliance still refuses to sign the treaty. If we lose their support, the eastern border won't hold." Rosalie paused. The conversation sounded important. She decided to wait until they finished. Then came Adrian's voice. Calm, steady, resolute. "If this treaty succeeds, I'll introduce Lady Celeste Voss as the kingdom's future Luna." Everything inside Rosalie stopped. The tray slipped from her trembling hands. Porcelain shattered across the stone floor. Hot tea splashed over the polished corridor. The sound echoed through the hallway. Silence followed, then hurried footsteps. The chamber door flew open. "Rosalie!" Adrian's face turned white. He looked from the broken dishes to the tears filling her eyes. She couldn't breathe. 6 years. 6 years of standing beside him through every battle. She had sold the last pieces of her family's inheritance when famine swept the kingdom. She had stitched wounded soldiers through nights without sleep. She had buried friends, comforted widows, held Adrian together when grief threatened to destroy him after the Civil War. Never once had she asked for recognition. She only wanted to stand beside the man she loved. And now, another woman would stand where she once had. Adrian reached for her. "It's not what you think." Rosalie stepped back before he could touch her. Behind him, several ministers stood frozen in the doorway. Among them, Lady Celeste Voss. She looked just as shocked as everyone else. Rosalie barely noticed. Her eyes never left Adrian. "I heard enough." "No, you didn't." His voice carried a desperation she had never heard before. "Please, let me explain." She smiled. It wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was the heartbreaking smile of someone whose heart had broken so completely, it no longer had the strength to argue. What explanation could possibly change those words? Adrian opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The silence answered for him. Rosalie slowly removed the wedding band from her finger. She didn't hand it to him. She simply closed her fingers around it. "Not yet. Not here. Not in front of the entire royal council. I won't embarrass either of us." She lowered her eyes. "If you've already chosen your future, I'll quietly step out of it." She turned and walked away. "Rosalie!" Adrian called after her. She didn't stop. He took one step to follow. The Chancellor quickly caught his arm. "Your Majesty!" Adrian pulled free immediately. But by then, Rosalie had already disappeared around the corner. Only the shattered lunch tray remained. A bowl rolled slowly across the stone floor, before finally coming to rest at Adrian's feet. He stared at it, his chest tightening with a fear he couldn't yet explain. Inside the overturned basket rested a single white moonflower, the same flower he had tucked into Rosalie's hair on the day they married, the day he had whispered, "There will never be another Luna." He closed his eyes. If only she had stayed 1 minute longer, she would have heard the rest of the sentence. Instead, she walked away believing the first half of his words, while the second half remained trapped forever inside the room she had just left. Rosalie didn't cry until she closed the door to the Luna wing. Only then, when no one could see her, did the tears finally fall. She leaned against the heavy oak door, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth to keep the sobs from escaping. The palace beyond her chambers continued celebrating. Servants hurried through the corridors. Musicians played cheerful melodies. Somewhere in the distance, nobles laughed. The kingdom believed its king and queen were happier than ever. Only Rosalie knew her marriage had ended before sunset. She slowly walked into her bedroom. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning. The moonlight curtains drifted gently in the evening breeze. Fresh flowers scented the room. Adrian's favorite cloak still hung beside hers. She stared at it for a long moment, then quietly looked away. She opened a small cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside lay the few things that had belonged to her before she became queen. Her mother's pearl necklace, a worn leather journal, a faded sketch of her childhood home, a simple traveling cloak. She folded them carefully into a small satchel. Nothing more. The royal gowns remained untouched. The jewels stayed locked inside their cases. The Luna crown rested upon its velvet cushion. She lifted it gently, ran her fingers over the silver engraving, then placed it back exactly where it belonged. "It deserves someone who still has a place here," she whispered. Finally, she slipped her wedding ring from her finger. She placed it beside the crown. The soft sound of gold touching velvet echoed through the silent room. Her gaze drifted toward the dressing table. A pressed white moonflower rested inside an old book. She smiled through fresh tears. Adrian had picked it on the morning of their wedding. "Whenever you doubt me," he had said with a grin, "I'll bring you another one." She picked up the flower. For several moments, she considered throwing it into the fire. Instead, she carried it to Adrian's study. The room stood empty. The scattered military reports still covered his desk. She laid the moonflower gently in the center. No letter, no accusation, no farewell. If 6 years together couldn't explain her silence, words never would. Before dawn, Rosalie quietly left the palace through the eastern gate. No royal escort, no servants. Only the stars watched her disappear into the darkness. The next morning, Adrian returned to the Luna wing. He hadn't slept. The moment the council meeting ended, he had rushed to find Rosalie. He rehearsed the explanation over and over. She would be angry. She had every right to be. But once she heard the truth, everything would be all right. He pushed open the bedroom door. "Rosalie?" Silence. The bed was perfectly made. The fireplace had gone cold. Her wardrobe remained full. Nothing appeared disturbed, except the crown, and the wedding ring resting beside it. His heart lurched. No. He searched every room. The music room, the library, the greenhouse she loved. Nothing. Captain Rowan arrived moments later. "Your Majesty? Seal every gate." Damien's voice shook. "No one leaves the capital." The captain hesitated. The Eastern Guards reported Her Majesty departed before sunrise. "What?" "Alone." Adrian felt the room spin. "Find her. I don't care how far she has gone. Bring my wife home." Before the captain could respond, hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. The royal physician entered, breathless. "Your Majesty, I've been looking everywhere for the Queen." Adrian grabbed his arm. "So have I." The physician looked confused. "She hasn't told you?" "Told me what?" The old man's face slowly drained of color. His eyes fell upon the abandoned wedding ring, then the empty room. Realization dawned. "Oh no." Adrian's stomach tightened. "What is it?" The physician swallowed hard. "Her Majesty asked me to keep it a surprise until tonight." His voice became barely a whisper. "She was carrying your child." The words struck like lightning. Adrian staggered backward. His gaze drifted toward the pressed moonflower lying alone on his desk. His wife hadn't just walked away. She had carried his unborn child with her, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, she believed he had already chosen another woman to replace them both. For the first time since becoming Alpha King, Adrian forgot how to breathe. The royal physician's words echoed through the empty chamber. She was carrying your child. No, that couldn't be true. If Rosalie had known, why hadn't she told him? Then he remembered. She had tried. She had come looking for him that afternoon, carrying his favorite lunch, smiling, hopeful. Instead of sharing the happiest news of their marriage, she had overheard the sentence that destroyed it. Adrian slowly lowered himself into the chair behind his desk. His eyes settled on the pressed moonflower. The flower looked impossibly small, yet it felt heavier than his crown. A hurried knock interrupted the silence. The High Chancellor entered. Behind him stood Lady Celeste Voss. Both wore expressions of quiet dread. Neither spoke first. Adrian finally raised his eyes. "Tell me." The Chancellor closed the door. "Your Majesty—" Her Majesty left before we could explain. Adrian laughed bitterly. "Explain? My wife believes I replaced her. What explanation could possibly change that?" The old man drew a slow breath, the one she never heard. Silence filled the room. Then the Chancellor repeated the entire conversation exactly as it had happened. "The Northern Alliance demanded proof that your marriage had become politically unstable. They believed only a divided royal household would make you desperate enough to accept their conditions. So we allowed enemy spies to overhear part of a false conversation." Lady Celeste stepped forward. "It was my idea." Adrian looked at her. She lowered her eyes. "I volunteered. I've never loved you. I never wanted your throne. I only wanted the spies to believe the kingdom was vulnerable," the Chancellor continued. You had already begun saying the next sentence. Adrian closed his eyes. Because now, he remembered every word. "I'll introduce Lady Celeste Voss as the kingdom's future Luna. Only long enough to fool the spies hiding inside these walls. Once they expose themselves, Rosalie will be the first person I tell." He never got the chance. The tray had shattered. Rosalie had walked away, and the rest of the sentence died with the sound of breaking porcelain. Adrian covered his face with both hands. "I should have told her before we began." The Chancellor nodded sadly. "Yes, you warned me. I did. You said no operation was worth hiding something like this from my wife. I did." Adrian looked toward Celeste. "I'm sorry." She shook her head immediately. "No, Your Majesty. I'm not the one who deserves that apology." 3 days later, the operation succeeded. Royal guards arrested 6 enemy spies, hiding inside the capital. Hidden messages confirmed they had believed every word of the staged conversation. The Northern Alliance exposed its secret alliance with the rival kingdom. A war that might have killed thousands ended before it ever began. The kingdom celebrated. The operation was declared one of the greatest intelligence victories in royal history. No one celebrated inside the palace, because the victory had cost the king everything he truly loved. Weeks became months. Months became years. Every ship leaving the kingdom carried one order: search for Queen Rosalie. Every merchant crossing the borders received her portrait. Every healer's sanctuary, every monastery, every coastal village, every distant kingdom, nothing. It was as though the sea itself had swallowed her. Late one winter evening, Adrian wandered into the nursery Rosalie had secretly begun preparing. He hadn't entered before. The room was unfinished. A tiny wooden cradle stood against the wall. Beside it rested a folded baby blanket. Half embroidered, one corner still held the needle where Rosalie had stopped sewing. He picked it up carefully. For the first time in 10 years of ruling, the Alpha King wept without trying to hide it. He had saved his kingdom through strategy, protected his people through sacrifice, defeated enemies through deception. But the one lie meant to protect everyone had destroyed the only family he had ever wanted. Far beyond the eastern sea, a lonely ship approached a small coastal village. Among its exhausted passengers, a pregnant young woman quietly stepped onto unfamiliar soil. She carried no crown, no title, only a broken heart and the tiny life she refused to let that heartbreak destroy. Rosalie collapsed before she reached the village. The long voyage across the eastern sea had taken everything she had left. For days, she had survived on little more than bread and rainwater. She had hidden her pregnancy beneath an oversized travel cloak. She had avoided questions, avoided mirrors, avoided every reminder of the woman she used to be. When her knees finally gave way on the dusty road leading into the fishing village of Windhaven, she expected to wake in heaven. Instead, she awoke to the smell of lavender. Sunlight streamed through an open window. The gentle sound of waves drifted in from the nearby shore. An elderly woman smiled as Rosalie slowly opened her eyes. "So, you've decided to stay with us a little longer." Rosalie blinked. "Where am I?" "My clinic." The woman placed a cool cloth against Rosalie's forehead. "My name is Margaret. You collapsed outside my herb garden." Rosalie instinctively reached for her stomach. "My baby." Margaret smiled warmly. Healthy, strong, and already as stubborn as the mother, for the first time in weeks. Rosalie allowed herself to breathe. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. Margaret sat beside the bed without asking questions. She had treated enough broken hearts to recognize one. "When you're ready, you can tell me your story." Rosalie stared at the ceiling. "What if I never am?" The old healer gently squeezed her hand. "Then we'll simply begin with tomorrow." Rosalie laughed softly through her tears. Tomorrow, once, that word had shattered her heart. Now, spoken by a stranger, it somehow sounded hopeful again. Months later, the tiny clinic echoed with the cries of a newborn child. "It's a girl!" Margaret wrapped the baby carefully, before placing her into Rosalie's waiting arms. The little girl's silver eyes blinked sleepily. Beneath a blanket of dark curls, Rosalie smiled. "Hello, my little Eliana." The baby curled one tiny hand around her mother's finger. In that moment, Rosalie made herself one promise. Her daughter would never grow up believing love had to be earned through silence. The years passed quietly. Rosalie never returned to the Alpha Kingdom. Instead, she poured every ounce of love she still possessed into healing others. The tiny clinic became too small, so she built another, then another. Traveling physicians volunteered to work beside her. Young apprentices arrived, hoping to learn from the woman whose kindness spread faster than any rumor. No patient was turned away, not the poor, not wandering refugees, not wounded soldiers from kingdoms that had once been enemies. If they're suffering, they belong here. Those words became the guiding principle of every hospital she founded. Soon, people across the continent stopped asking for Dr. Margaret. They asked for Dr. Rosalie, the physician who never refused anyone, the woman whose hospitals charged no family who could not afford to pay. Children adored her. Village elders trusted her. Even rival kings quietly donated supplies to support her growing medical network. Few knew she had once worn a crown. She never mentioned it. To her patients, she was simply the doctor who remembered every child's birthday and every widow's name. One spring afternoon, little Eliana looked up from sorting bundles of lavender. "Mother?" Rosalie smiled. "Yes? Did I ever have a father?" The question caught her by surprise. She looked toward the sea for a long moment. Finally, she answered honestly, "Yes." "Was he kind?" Rosalie's eyes filled with quiet memories. "He was." "Then why isn't he here?" Rosalie knelt beside her daughter. "Because sometimes, good people make mistakes that change everything." Eliana considered that very seriously. "Do you hate him?" Rosalie smiled sadly. "No, I never did." She simply reached out and tucked a loose curl behind her daughter's ear. Some wounds didn't need hatred to remain painful. Far across the sea, a deadly fever had begun spreading through the Alpha Kingdom. Within months, desperate messengers would cross the ocean, searching for the only physician whose hospitals had never failed to stop an epidemic. they would be searching for Dr. Rosalie. Never imagining, they were also searching for the queen they had lost 10 years before. The fever spread faster than fire through dry grass. It began in one small border village. Within weeks, it reached the capital. Children burned with relentless fevers. Strong warriors collapsed where they stood. Entire households hung white cloth outside their doors to warn others away. The royal healers tried every remedy they knew. Nothing worked. Inside the palace infirmary, silence replaced confidence. The chief royal physician bowed his head before King Adrian. "Your Majesty, we're losing." Adrian looked around the crowded infirmary. Mothers held crying children. Fathers prayed beside sick spouses. Healers moved from bed to bed with exhausted eyes. "There has to be something." "There is." The physician handed him a thick medical journal. "The Eastern Coast." He pointed to a handwritten name repeated throughout the reports. Dr. Rosalie Everhart. "The hospitals she founded have stopped this fever twice. She developed a treatment none of us have been able to duplicate." Adrian stared at the name. His heart skipped. Rosalie. For 10 years, he had searched for his wife. Now, he finally knew where she was. But not because she wanted to be found. Because thousands of innocent lives depended on her. 3 days later, Adrian arrived in the quiet coastal village of Windhaven. No royal banners accompanied him. No soldiers announced his arrival. He came wearing a simple traveling cloak. The hospital stood on a hill overlooking the sea. Children played in its gardens, while recovering patients rested beneath flowering trees. No one looked frightened, only hopeful. A young nurse greeted him warmly. "Can I help you? I'm looking for Dr. Rosalie." The nurse smiled. "She's in the herb garden." Adrian followed the stone path around the hospital. Rows of medicinal plants stretched beneath the afternoon sun. At the center, a woman knelt beside a flower bed, teaching a little girl how to separate healing herbs from poisonous lookalikes. "Always smell the leaves first," Rosalie said gently. "The right medicine often announces itself." The little girl giggled. "I like the mint better." "So do I." Adrian stopped walking. For a moment, he simply watched. Rosalie looked peaceful, happier than he had ever dared imagine. The little girl looked up first. She couldn't have been older than 10. Dark curls framed her face. But her eyes... silver. His wolf stirred instantly. A deep, instinctive recognition flooded through him. His daughter. Before he could speak, the child tugged gently on Rosalie's sleeve. "Mother." Rosalie turned. The basket of herbs slipped from her hands. For several long seconds, neither she nor Adrian moved. The years between them disappeared into silence. Finally, the little girl looked curiously at the unfamiliar man. "Mother, who is that?" Rosalie closed her eyes briefly. She had imagined this moment countless times. She had never found the perfect answer. When she looked at Adrian again, she saw regret, hope, fear, everything he had carried for the last decade. She smiled softly. "He once meant everything to me. Nothing more. Not, he abandoned us. Not, he is your father." Only the truth she could speak without bitterness. The little girl nodded thoughtfully. "Oh." She walked closer to Adrian. "You look sad." He laughed quietly, despite the tears filling his eyes. "I suppose I am." She reached into the basket she was carrying. "You can have one." She held out a white moonflower. "My mother says flowers help people remember that difficult seasons don't last forever." Adrian accepted it with trembling hands. The same flower he had once tucked into Rosalie's hair on their wedding day. The same flower she had left on his desk before disappearing. His vision blurred. He looked at Rosalie. "I've spent 10 years searching for you," she answered gently. "I know." There was no anger in her voice. Only distance. The kind created not by hatred, but by time. She turned toward Eliana. "Would you help Nurse Margaret finish sorting the herbs?" The little girl smiled. Of course. She skipped happily toward the hospital, leaving Adrian and Rosalie alone for the first time in 10 long years. He looked down at the moonflower in his hand, then back at the woman he had never stopped loving. I owe you the rest of the sentence. Rosalie nodded quietly. Yes, you do. The herb garden grew quiet after Eliana disappeared into the hospital. Only the sound of the sea drifted through the afternoon air. For a long time, neither Adrian nor Rosalie spoke. 10 years of silence could not be crossed with hurried words. Finally, Adrian looked down at the moonflower, still resting in his hand. I've replayed that afternoon every day. Rosalie waited. He drew a slow breath. You heard me say, I'll introduce Lady Celeste Voss as the kingdom's future Luna. She nodded once. I remember every word. I never finished the sentence. His voice cracked. I know. That answer surprised him. You know? She smiled sadly. I knew the moment I saw you. He frowned. I've spent the last 10 years wondering what kind of man you became. The man standing in front of me isn't someone who would have replaced his wife without a reason. She looked toward the waves. I always believed there had been another sentence. Adrian stared at her in disbelief. If you believed that, why didn't you come back? She met his eyes. Finish it, he nodded. The Northern Alliance had spies inside the palace. They believed our marriage was our greatest political strength. The Chancellor suggested letting them overhear a false conversation. So I agreed to pretend that Lady Celeste would become the future Luna. He swallowed hard. The rest of the sentence was only long enough to fool the spies hiding inside these walls. Once they reveal themselves, Rosalie will be the first person I tell. Silence. The wind carried the scent of lavender between them. I never reached those words. Rosalie nodded gently. I know. I should have told you before the operation. Yes. I thought I was protecting you. I know. I was wrong. Yes. Each answer came calmly, without anger, without accusation, with only truth. Adrian lowered his head. I've imagined this conversation 1,000 times. In every version, I hoped the truth would somehow fix everything. Rosalie smiled with quiet sadness. The truth heals. It doesn't erase. He closed his eyes. I lost you because of one unfinished sentence. No, her voice stopped him. You lost me because of one finished habit. He looked up. What do you mean? You had already decided that protecting me meant keeping me outside important decisions. She stepped closer. Tell me honestly, if I had walked into that room 1 minute later, if the operation had succeeded exactly as planned, would you have trusted me enough to tell me the truth before announcing it publicly? Adrian opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because he knew the answer. He had planned to tell her afterward, after the spies were caught, after the danger had passed, after everything was over, not before. Rosalie saw the answer in his silence. She smiled, not triumphantly, sadly. That's why I left. Not because I believed you loved another woman, but because I realized you believed I needed protection more than partnership. The words settled heavily between them. I was your wife, she continued softly, your queen, your closest ally. But when the most important decision of our marriage arrived, you chose to carry it alone. Adrian felt tears sting his eyes. I never meant to make you feel excluded. I know. I never doubted your love. She reached out and gently closed his fingers around the moonflower. I doubted whether you truly saw me as someone strong enough to stand beside you. For the first time, Adrian understood the depth of his mistake. The lie had not destroyed his marriage. The secrecy had. He looked toward the hospital where Eliana laughed with the other children. I can't undo 10 years. No. Rosalie followed his gaze. You can't. He nodded slowly. But if you'll allow me, I'd like to spend whatever years I have left becoming the father she deserves. Rosalie looked at him for a long moment, then quietly answered, "That decision is no longer mine alone." She smiled toward the hospital. "It belongs to our daughter." Rosalie did not ask Adrian to stay. She did not ask him to leave. She simply returned to work. Patients still needed medicine. Children still needed comfort. The fever had not paused for broken hearts. Neither could she. The next morning, Adrian arrived before sunrise. He wasn't wearing a crown. He wasn't surrounded by guards. He carried 2 heavy crates filled with medical supplies. A young nurse looked at him in confusion. "Your Majesty," he smiled politely. "Just Adrian. Where do these go?" She pointed toward the pharmacy. He carried them without another word. That became his routine. Every morning, he arrived before dawn. He chopped firewood, cleaned empty hospital rooms, loaded wagons with medicine. He helped repair broken fences. When patients recognized the Alpha King carrying water buckets across the courtyard, they stared in disbelief. Adrian never explained himself. He simply worked. Rosalie watched quietly. He never once asked, "When are you coming home?" He never spoke about the past, unless she did. Instead, he learned the names of every patient, every nurse, every orphan living beside the hospital. One rainy afternoon, little Eliana found him repairing a broken swing. "You don't know much about carpentry," Adrian laughed. "Is it that obvious?" She pointed toward the crooked seat. "I think children are supposed to stay on the swing. I was hoping gravity had become more forgiving," she giggled. "I'll help." Together, they rebuilt the swing properly. When they finished, Eliana climbed onto it proudly. "It works." Adrian smiled. "I'm glad." She studied him for a long moment. "You keep coming back." "I do. Most important people leave after one visit." "I used to," he answered honestly. "I don't want to anymore." She seemed satisfied with that answer. Over the following weeks, their conversations became longer. She showed him the herb garden. He taught her how to ride a horse. She introduced him to every stray cat living behind the hospital kitchen. He pretended not to notice when she secretly slipped extra fish to each one. One evening, while watching the sunset together, Eliana asked softly, "Can I tell you something?" "Always." "I think," she hesitated. "I like having you here." Adrian felt his throat tighten. "I like being here too," she smiled. "Good." Then she took his hand as naturally as breathing. Rosalie watched from the hospital porch. Margaret stepped beside her. "He's changed." Rosalie nodded. "Yes. Do you trust him?" Rosalie looked toward Adrian, laughing, as Eliana proudly introduced him to another stray kitten. "I trust the man he is becoming." Margaret smiled knowingly. Sometimes, that's even stronger than trusting who someone used to be. Months passed. The epidemic finally ended. The last patient left the hospital healthy. The village celebrated with music, lanterns, and dancing beneath the stars. Later that evening, Adrian found Rosalie walking through a meadow filled with blooming moonflowers. The same flowers that had witnessed both the beginning and the breaking of their love. He stopped a respectful distance away. "I don't deserve another chance." Rosalie smiled. "No, I don't." He nodded. "I know." Silence settled gently between them. Then he asked, "But may I spend the rest of my life becoming someone worthy of one?" Rosalie looked toward the hill, where Eliana chased glowing fireflies with the village children, then back at Adrian. This time, she held out her hand. No more unfinished sentences. Adrian took it carefully. "As long as I live, you'll know every sentence from beginning to end." For the first time in 10 years, they stood together beneath the moonflowers, not because the past had disappeared, but because they had finally learned that love is not protected by silence, it is protected by truth, and somewhere nearby, their daughter looked back at them and smiled. 3 years later, The Alpha Kingdom no longer resembled the nation Rosalie had left behind. The hospitals she had founded across the eastern coast now worked alongside the Royal Healing Corps. No village was too remote, no patient too poor, no child was ever turned away. The epidemic that had once threatened to destroy the kingdom became the reason its people built the finest public healthcare system on the continent. At the center of it all stood two people who had learned the hardest lesson of their lives: not how to survive war, not how to win treaties, but how to tell each other the truth before fear had the chance to speak first. Rosalie had returned to the capital, not because Adrian had begged her, because she chose to. She returned as queen once more, but this time she negotiated one condition before accepting the Luna crown again. No royal decision that affects our family will ever be hidden from either of us. Adrian agreed before she had even finished speaking. I should have promised that years ago. You did, Rosalie smiled gently. You just never realized how important the promise was. Together, they presented a new royal decree before the Grand Council. The Chancellor read it aloud. By order of their majesties, any matter affecting the royal family, succession, political standing, or personal safety shall be shared fully between bonded mates before action is taken. A young minister looked surprised. Even matters of national security? Adrian answered without hesitation. Especially those. The chamber fell silent. He continued, My queen is not someone I protect by keeping secrets. She is the person I trust to help carry them. The decree became known across the continent as the Moonflower Promise. Its purpose reached far beyond the palace. Military commanders were encouraged to consult their councils before making dangerous decisions. Pack leaders held open forums where citizens could voice concerns without fear. Neighboring kingdoms copied many of the reforms. Historians later wrote that one unfinished sentence had reshaped how an entire generation understood leadership. Lady Celeste Voss remained one of the royal family's closest advisors. For years, she had quietly blamed herself for Rosalie's disappearance. One afternoon, she approached Rosalie in the palace gardens. I've carried guilt for so long. Rosalie reached out and took her hands. You helped save the kingdom, but I helped break your heart. Rosalie shook her head. No. The secret broke my heart. You were simply standing inside it. Tears filled Celeste's eyes. Thank you. Rosalie smiled warmly. Let's not waste another decade punishing ourselves for a lesson we've already learned. Nearby, 12-year-old Princess Eliana practiced sword forms with Adrian. She stopped suddenly. Father? He lowered his training sword. Yes? When I'm queen someday, I want everyone to feel safe telling me the truth. Adrian smiled. Then you'll already be wiser than I was. She frowned. No, you taught me. Rosalie watched them together. The years they had lost could never be returned, but they had built something equally precious. Years they would never lose again. That evening, the royal family walked through the Moonflower Garden. The flowers glowed beneath the full moon, exactly as they had on the night Adrian first tucked one into Rosalie's hair. He picked another blossom. Smiling, he placed it behind her ear. This one comes with a completed sentence. She laughed. I'd certainly hope so. He leaned closer. I love you. I trust you. And I'll never again mistake silence for protection. Rosalie rested her head against his shoulder. This is the promise I was waiting to hear. Above them, the moonflowers swayed gently in the night breeze. No longer symbols of heartbreak, but living reminders that love grows strongest where nothing important is left unsaid. 30 years later, young couples traveled from every corner of the continent to visit the Moonflower Garden. Some came before their wedding. Others came after difficult seasons in their marriages. All came to hear the same story. Not the story of a king who almost lost his queen, but the story of two people who discovered that love cannot survive where truth is treated as a burden. The Moonflower Promise had become more than a royal law. It had become a way of life. Future alphas were taught that strength was not measured by how many secrets they could carry alone. It was measured by knowing whom to trust enough to carry those burdens with them. Queen Rosalie's hospitals had grown into the largest healing network on the continent. No patient was ever asked where they came from before receiving treatment. Princess Eliana, now a respected young queen beside her own mate, expanded the network even further. She often told her physicians, "Medicine heals the body. Trust heals the people who must keep living afterward." King Adrian had grown older. Silver streaked his dark hair. His once restless spirit had settled into quiet wisdom. Whenever young rulers visited the palace asking for advice, they expected lessons about warfare or diplomacy. Instead, he led them to the Moonflower Garden. There, beneath the flowers that had witnessed both his greatest mistake and his greatest redemption, he asked only one question. When the person you love asks you to listen, what will your answer be? One young alpha smiled confidently. "I'll listen." Adrian gently shook his head. "That isn't enough." The young man looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Listening isn't waiting for your turn to explain. It isn't assuming you'll have time tomorrow." He looked toward Rosalie, who was laughing with their grandchildren as they chased butterflies through the garden. It is believing that the person standing before you may be carrying something too important to postpone. The young alpha lowered his head thoughtfully. "I'll remember that." "I hope you do." Adrian smiled. "Because some lessons cost more than anyone should have to pay." As evening settled over the palace, Rosalie joined him beneath the oldest moonflower vine. She slipped her hand into his. "You've been giving speeches again." He laughed softly. "I've become predictable. I like predictable." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "So do I." For a while, they simply watched the children play. Their grandchildren knew nothing of the pain that had almost prevented their family from existing. They knew only laughter, only love, only the certainty that their grandparents always spoke honestly to one another, exactly as they had promised. Above the entrance to the royal council chamber, the words carved decades earlier remained untouched by time. "Love cannot flourish where trust is treated as a privilege instead of a promise." Every royal advisor passed beneath those words before entering the council. Every alpha remembered them before making decisions. Every generation inherited not just a kingdom, but a lesson. When historians wrote about Adrian and Rosalie, they did not describe them as the perfect king and queen. They described them as the rulers who transformed one painful misunderstanding into a legacy that strengthened countless marriages. Because perfection had never been their gift. Growth was. On the final page of Queen Rosalie's personal journal, discovered many years after her peaceful passing, she had written one last reflection. "The sentence that broke my heart was never finished." Perhaps that was necessary, because together, we spent the rest of our lives finishing it, with honesty, trust, forgiveness, and love. And that became the story remembered across the continent. Not that a queen disappeared after hearing the wrong words, but that two people brave enough to face the truth discovered something greater than a perfect beginning. They built a lifetime where no important sentence was ever left unfinished again.